Okay, so in the last video we discussed the approach that we're going to take for setting up a stretchy FK-IK blending system on our arm. In this video, let's jump over into Houdini and actually get that implemented. So I'm going to jump over into Houdini. And the first thing I want to do is create a place where we're going to have all of the controls for that system. I'm going to create a subnet and turn that into a digital asset. And on that asset, I'm going to create a number of parameters that are going to relate to the various parameters of our stretchy FK-IK system. So I'm going to jump over to where our arm is, and let's drop down a new subnet. And I'm going to rename this to arm FK-IK controls. If we right click, we can create a digital asset. I am going to give this the operator name of arm FK-IK controls. Leave that with the label. Now, in terms of an OTL file to save this in, I'm going to save this into where our HIP file is. I'm going to create a new folder called OTLs. And we have two choices here. We could either create a single Goblin OTL, if you like, and put all of the assets that we create when setting up this character into that one OTL file. And that would allow it to very easily be distributed amongst other artists. You just take that one OTL file. As long as they install that OTL file, you could drop in an instance of your character and everything would come along with the character. However, in this case, something like our ARM FK-IK controls might be very useful on another project or on a different character in the same project. So it would make a lot of sense to have this in a separate OTL file, and then you just have a number of OTL files that need to be carried over and installed by the artist when setting up their file. So I'm going to go with the approach of keeping things in separate OTL files. Feel free to create everything into a single OTL file if that's your preferred method of working. So I'm going to go ahead and create an arm FK-IK controls.otl and accept that. Then accept the pop-up window that will bring up the type properties for our asset. I want to jump over to the parameters tab. Let's make the transform folder invisible and the subnet folder invisible. I'm then going to create a new folder, and this folder will be our arm FK-IK controls. And let's go ahead and inside this create a number of parameters. The first parameter is going to be our blend parameter, our FK-IK blend, that's going to be used to control blending back and forth between FK and IK, both in terms of the rotations and in terms of the stretchiness parameters. So I'm going to call this FK-IK blend, give this a label of FK-IK blend, and we do want to lock this between a value of 0 and a value of 1. The next parameter is going to be our lock for our stretchiness. So I'm going to give this a name of lock, a label of arm stretchiness. And again, this needs to be locked between a minimum of 0 and a maximum of 1. The next four parameters we're going to create are going to deal with our manual stretch parameters for the arm. That's going to be both the upper FK stretch, the lower FK stretch, and the upper IK stretch and lower IK stretch. So I'm going to create four float parameters. This will be our upper IK stretch. And let's actually start out with our FK. So upper FK stretch. Upper FK stretch. I want to lock this with a minimum value of 1, so we cannot shrink the bone, we can only stretch the bone. We've got our lower FK stretch. And again, I want to lock this with a minimum value of 1. We've got our upper IK stretch. And again, lock that with a minimum value of 1. And then finally, our lower IK stretch. And once again, lock that with a minimum value of 1. So with those in place, we can go ahead and accept the type properties. And we can rename this to L_arm FK-IK controls, since it's dealing with our left arm. So let's go ahead and get our blend parameter linked up down onto our inverse kinematics chop so that we can actually drive blending back and forth between our FK rotations and our IK rotations. So I'm going to go ahead and copy our blend parameter. Jump down inside our kinchops network, and on the arm kinematics I'm going to copy relative reference onto the blend parameter on L_arm kinematics. So that means now if we were to rotate in FK our bones would indeed be driven by FK. And then if we were to blend over to IK, the bones are going to go back and forth between being driven by FK and being driven by IK. So I'm going to zero out the parameters on our FK controls. So from there, the next thing I'd really like to do is deal with setting up the stretch ratio. Currently we do have a stretch ratio in place on our upper arm. And we know that that's using our original length, our eye length parameter to drive that. Let's bring that up in an expression editor. There we go. It's using eye length to drive that. And we know we need to drive this based on what is going to be our stretched IK length. That means we need to take our eye length and multiply it by the upper or lower, depending on the bone, IK stretch parameters, and use that to drive our stretch ratio as opposed to the original length. We saw that back when we dealt with setting up our leg. So let's go ahead, and on our upper arm, I'm going to edit the parameter interface. And inside our stretchy IK folder, I want to create a new parameter, and that's going to be our IK stretch length parameter. So IK stretched length. I can right click and copy that parameter and accept. If we come down to our lower arm and edit its parameter interface, I can right click on eye bone length, paste. That's going to paste that parameter in for our lower arm as well. So now that we have both of those parameters in place, let's jump over to the upper arm and set its IK stretched length to be equal to its eye length parameter multiplied by, we want to jump to our L underscore arm FK IK controls / we want to grab the upper IK stretch parameter. So whatever that parameter is set to is going to be multiplied by our bone length, and that's going to drive the IK stretch length. In the same way, we can copy this, paste that over for our lower arm into its IK stretch length, but of course in this case we're dealing with the lower IK stretch instead of the upper IK stretch. So we can accept that and see that whatever we set on our lower IK stretch is going to change the stretch length. Then back on our upper arm, we can go over to its stretch ratio, and we can now replace the references to eye length with references to IK stretch length. So indeed, we are referencing the correct length of the IK bone chain and not the original length of the IK bone chain. So now that we've got that in place, our stretch ratio is correct. We now need to deal with building that stretch factor, that blended stretch factor between our FK stretchiness and our IK stretchiness. And I'm going to create this on our upper arm underneath the stretchy IK folder. So on our upper arm, let's edit the parameter interface. I'm going to create a new float parameter, and this is going to be our stretch factor. So let's accept that and bring up the expression editor on that parameter. And we can go ahead and set this up so that we blend back and forth between our FK and our IK stretchiness. So we know that we have that FK-IK blend parameter on our asset. That's going to be used to linear interpolate between our upper FK stretch and our upper IK stretch multiplied by our stretch ratio. That's the manual for the FK and the manual and automatic for the IK, and we saw the manual and automatic getting multiplied together over with our leg. The only difference here now is that we're blending between that and our FK. So let's go ahead and take 1 minus our L underscore arm FK-IK controls / FK-IK blend. So we want to grab the FK-IK blend parameter, 1 minus that, since we're dealing in this case with what we want to have 100% when that value is set to 0. And I want to multiply that by L underscore arm FK-IK controls / in this case I want to grab the upper FK stretch. So that's going to be our FK value. We can now drop down to a new line just to keep things clear. And now we want what is going to happen when we're blended over to IK. So I want to grab our L underscore arm FK-IK controls FK-IK blend. So now we're taking that parameter, not 1 minus that parameter. I want to multiply that by our L underscore arm FK-IK controls / upper IK stretch. And I want to multiply that by our stretch ratio, which exists on our current bone, so we can just reference that directly. And that's going to give us that blended stretch factor that will blend back and forth between our IK stretch and our FK stretch. So if we accept that, we can see that we have a stretch factor currently of 1, and that's because we're set to FK currently, and our current FK stretchiness is set to 1. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to tear off a copy of this parameter pane and pin it. I'm then going to jump over to our bone so we can see the stretch factor as we change various parameters. So let's say that we're dealing with our FK. If we change our upper FK stretch, as we start increasing that, our stretch factor increases. If we blend over to IK, that's going to blend back down to a value of 1. But if we start increasing the upper IK stretch, that's going to change our stretch factor. We can see it changing our stretch length as well. And we can now blend back and forth between those. And obviously, our stretch factor dealing with our stretch ratio, rather, dealing with our IK handle, where that's positioned compared to the length of the bone chain, that will all be generated correctly as well. So we've got that in place for our upper arm. We are going to need a stretch factor for our lower arm, since we need to reference the lower FK stretch and lower IK stretch. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to edit the parameter interface for our upper arm, copy that stretch factor parameter, then edit the parameter interface for our lower arm and paste that parameter in. So paste and accept. Just jump over to the stretchy IK tab for that bone. Then grab the entire expression for our stretch factor on the upper arm and paste that in for our lower arm, editing, of course, the fact that we now want our lower FK stretch instead of the upper FK stretch. We want the lower IK stretch. And stretch ratio no longer exists on ourselves, it now exists on the upper arm, so we can jump up and grab L underscore upper arm / stretch ratio, and that will grab the stretch ratio up on the upper arm, so we can accept that. So that's now going to give us a stretch factor for our lower arm that's going to work in the exact same way as for our upper arm. So now that we have that, we can work out our new bone length by multiplying our eye length by that parameter. But of course, we also have the lock, the ability to lock our stretchiness. So we need to go ahead and also take that into account when setting up our bone length. So I'm going to jump over to our upper arm and bring up the expression for our bone length. And in this case, I'm going to delete out the reference to stretch ratio, but leave the reference to our current eye length. So we're going to multiply our initial length, and now we need to blend between a value of 1 when lock is set to 0 and whatever our stretch factor we just calculated is when lock is set to 1. So we're going to take 1 minus L underscore arm FKIK controls / lock, 1 minus lock, and that's going to be when our lock is set to 0, that will give us that value of 1 that we want multiplied by eye length. We're going to add to that L underscore arm FKIK controls / lock, multiply that in with our stretch factor, and that will give us the value that we want when lock is set to a value of 1. This will equate to 0, but this will equate to 1. 1 times our stretch factor is the value that we indeed want. And I'm going to reference the stretch factor parameter that is on ourselves. So that's going to give us what if we want to have stretchiness enabled. I do need to close off the parenthesis for all of that. So that's going to equate to either a value of 1 or blend over to a value of our stretch factor. I want the result of that to be multiplied by our eye length parameter, giving us the final bone length. If we accept that, we can see that currently the bone length is equal to our eye length since we are not enabling stretchiness. I am going to copy that exact expression because it's the exact same expression that we need to now apply to the bone length on our lower arm, since it's referencing the stretch factor parameter locally. That means it's referencing our stretch factor parameter, and the lock parameter obviously exists in the same location for both of those bones. So now that we have that in place, we can now play around with setting up our stretchiness and also blending between FK and IK. So you'll see that if we're set to FK and we start trying to stretch the upper arm and stretch the lower arm based on FK, arm stretchiness set to 0 is denying us from doing that. However, as we start increasing arm stretchiness, we can see that our arms, both upper and lower, are being stretched. There's the upper, there's the lower. But if we were to then blend over to IK, IK is going to shrink back down to not being stretched. We could boost in IK stretchiness, and that's going to allow us to blend back and forth between that stretchiness. We can even come in, grab our end effector when set to IK, pull that to the limits. You'll see that we only start stretching when we hit that very upper limit. So here we're not stretching, even though before we would have been. We only start stretching again once we hit the limit of the length. That means our IK stretch length and the references on our stretch ratio to that parameter are indeed working correctly. And even with all of that in place, if we were to lock stretchiness, we're back down to normal, and we can blend between that and our FK. So there's our FK. If we took our FK back down and our lower FK back down also, we can see that we can blend back and forth between these. So I'm going to set those back to all a value of 1 and leave arm stretchiness with a value of 1, and then let's go ahead and reset our IK handle to its initial position. So with that, that is going to deal with setting up blending between stretchy FK and stretchy IK and giving ourselves the ability to lock that stretchiness. Thanks a lot, everyone.